Right now, across southern and eastern England, people are checking the forecast for the first time in weeks, and actually seeing a number that starts with a 2 instead of a 3. After peaking around 35 to 36 degrees Celsius earlier this week, thunderstorms are forecast to break the heat down over the coming days, with fresher, cooler Atlantic air finally returning by the weekend of July the 18th and 19th. It is the UK's third heat wave of the year, and this one is ending the same way the previous two did, not with a gradual cool down, but with storms slamming into a dome of high pressure that has been sitting in place for days. Here is the part that has forecasters paying closer attention than a simple heat wave ending would normally deserve. At almost the exact same moment. This relief is arriving in Britain. A completely different kind of system is organizing over the Gulf of Mexico, one that has nothing to do with heat and everything to do with rain, and it is on track to become the Atlantic hurricane season's second named storm on almost exactly the calendar date meteorologists expect it, historically, to arrive. The heat everyone has been talking about all month is genuinely breaking. What is building in behind it is the part nobody is fully talking about yet. No hype, no exaggeration, just what the data from the Met Office, the National Hurricane Center, and the meteorologists actually tracking this pattern are saying. If the heat has finally broken where you live, or if you are watching a new system building instead, drop a comment and tell me what your sky actually looks like right now. I read every one of these. If you want grounded weather coverage instead of panic headlines, subscribe. It is free, and a like helps this reach people before the next system arrives. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. Let us start with the actual good news, because it is real and worth stating plainly before getting into what comes next. The UK's current heat wave, its third of 2026, began around the 4th of July and has held on considerably longer than either of the two waves before it, peaking in the mid-30s Celsius across southern and eastern England through the middle of this week. That heat sits on top of a genuinely historic June, when the country broke its national June temperature record on 3 consecutive days, climbing from 36.7 degrees Celsius at Merrifield in Somerset to a provisional 37.3 degrees at Santon-Downham in Suffolk on June the 26th, prompting the Met Office to issue a red extreme heat warning, its most serious classification, while more than 150 weather stations, some holding over a century of data, logged their hottest June day ever recorded. That same underlying heat dome made late June the worst heat wave ever recorded across the wider European continent, with Spain reaching 45.1 degrees Celsius and Germany a provisional 41.5. The UK Health Security Agency issued amber heat health alerts covering London and much of England from the 8th through the 12th of July, warning specifically of increased strain on healthcare and social care services during that stretch. Now, finally, thunderstorms are forecast to break this third UK wave down completely, dropping temperatures to around 27 degrees by Thursday and down to roughly 24 degrees by Saturday as cooler, fresher air moves in off the Atlantic. Forecasters are careful to note that predictions this far out remain provisional and can shift by a day or two. But the overall signal, an actual sustained cooldown rather than another brief lull before the next spike, appears to be real this time. Across the Atlantic, the United States has been going through a strikingly similar rhythm, just offset by a few days. A fresh round of record-breaking heat began over the weekend in the Southwest and Great Plains, before pushing toward the eastern half of the country through the middle of this week, arriving only about 2 weeks after large. Swaths of the country had already sweated through a days-long heat wave over the 4th of July holiday. That earlier wave alone placed over 165 million Americans across the Midwest and East at risk of major or extreme heat-related health issues, according to the National Weather Service's Experimental Heat Risk Index, with New York City forecast to reach as high as 103 degrees Fahrenheit during its peak, and Philadelphia forecast even hotter, with some meteorologists projecting readings near 107 degrees. As of the most recent tally, that 4th of July heat wave alone had been tied to 44 confirmed deaths across North America, and it disrupted transportation as much as it disrupted daily life, with Amtrak slowing train speeds across its Northeast Corridor and regional rail operators in Philadelphia reporting delays and outright cancellations, specifically because of the extreme heat bearing down on the tracks themselves. Now, with this second wave working through its own life cycle, the same basic pattern is playing out again. Extreme heat building, peaking, and then finally breaking down as a stronger weather system finally muscles its way through, a rhythm that has effectively repeated itself every 2 to 3 weeks since the start of summer. Here is where the story stops being simply about heat ending and starts being about what forecasters are actually uneasy about, because the timing of what comes next is not a coincidence, and meteorologists tracking it have been explicit about why. An area of low pressure has been organizing in the Gulf of Mexico, and as of the most recent National Hurricane Center outlook, it carries roughly a 20% chance of developing into a tropical depression or tropical storm over the coming days. If it earns a name, it would become Tropical Storm Bertha, the second, named storm of this year's Atlantic hurricane season, following Tropical Storm Arthur, which formed in mid-June near the upper Texas coast and brought flooding rainfall across Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia before dissipating. What makes this particular timing worth noting is that the average date for the Atlantic season's second named storm to form is July the 17th, meaning this system, whether or not it ever technically earns Bertha's name, is arriving almost exactly on the historical schedule. A genuinely unusual thing to be able to say plainly in a year that has otherwise broken so many records in one direction or another. The percentage chance of formal development is, on its own, not the part that has forecasters concerned, and it would be dishonest to inflate a 20% probability into something more dramatic than it actually is. What has meteorologists genuinely uneasy is what this system is expected to do regardless of whether it ever organizes into a named storm at all. Forecasters say flooding rain of 3 to 5 inches is considered near certain across Tampa Bay, the Big Bend region, and the Florida Panhandle over the coming days, an amount capable of producing significant localized flooding on its own, storm name or not. That distinction between a system's formal classification and its actual rainfall threat is exactly the pattern that produced dangerous, in some cases life-threatening, flooding earlier this summer when Arthur's remnant moisture swept across 3 states, even after the storm itself had technically dissipated. It is also worth being direct about why the system is struggling to organize cleanly in the first place, since it connects back to one of this year's biggest overall weather stories. Wind shear over the Caribbean Sea has been running at the second highest level ever recorded for early July, according to hurricane expert Michael Lowry, a direct consequence of this year's rapidly strengthening El Nino, since El Nino reliably increases wind shear across the Atlantic's main tropical development region. The disruptive, storm-tearing winds that make it considerably harder for a disorganized cluster of thunderstorms to wind itself up into an actual tropical cyclone. Sea surface temperatures across parts of the tropical Atlantic have actually been running near or even slightly below average this year, a genuinely unusual signal for mid-July. And forecasters say this strengthening El Nino could keep the wider Atlantic basin relatively quiet through the rest of this month and potentially into August. The month tropical activity typically begins rising sharply regardless of the background climate pattern in any given year. That El Nino influence is the same reason NOAA's official seasonal outlook, issued earlier this year, gave a 55% chance of a below normal Atlantic hurricane season overall, projecting somewhere between 8 and 14 named storms, compared to the historical average of roughly 14, including 3 to 6 hurricanes and 1 to 3 major hurricanes. On paper, that sounds like reassuring news, and in a narrow sense, it is. But meteorologists have been explicit that a quieter than average season does not mean a lower risk season for the people who actually live along the coastline. It eventually reaches. AccuWeather's tropical forecasting team has estimated that even in a below normal year, 3 to 5 named storms are still likely to directly impact the United States, with Arthur already accounting for one of those before this current system had even organized. A below normal season produces fewer storms overall. It does not meaningfully reduce how intense or how dangerous the storms that do manage to form can still become once conditions do finally align in their favor. The same lesson underlying nearly every extreme weather story covered on this channel this year. NOAA's own outlook made a point of stressing this exact distinction when it was first released, noting explicitly that even a below-average season can still produce a destructive landfall, a caveat that tends to get lost the moment headlines shrink a detailed seasonal forecast down to a single word like quiet. This is the genuine tension sitting underneath this week's forecast, and it is worth stating plainly rather than letting it get lost between 2 separate, seemingly unrelated headlines. The heat dome, responsible for weeks of record-breaking temperatures across both the UK and the United States, is, by most current forecasts, actually breaking down this week, a real and meaningful reprieve, after one of the most extreme heat stretches either region has experienced in decades. At the same moment, the same broad atmospheric conditions, a warming Pacific driving a historically strong El Nino, record ocean heat content, and a jet stream that has spent the entire summer locked into stuck, resonant patterns, are also the exact ingredients steering a new system toward Florida on almost the precise calendar date history would predict, even in a season. Official forecasters expect to run quieter than average overall. Breaking heat and building rain are not 2 separate stories playing out, by coincidence in the same week. They are connected outputs of the same underlying pattern, the heat dome finally releasing the moisture it spent weeks trapping, in exactly the way this channel has walked through with previous heat waves this summer, just now playing out on a slightly different stage, over Florida instead of Missouri or Tennessee. Forecasters have also flagged that this same pattern shift carries longer range implications well beyond the single weekend, with early seasonal guidance already pointing toward a stronger El Nino influence, extending into autumn and reshaping the broader pattern across North America as the year continues, a signal worth watching closely rather than dismissing, simply because it points months ahead rather than days. There is a genuinely important lesson in how this particular system is being covered by forecasters, one worth carrying forward into the rest of this year's hurricane season. A 20% chance of formal tropical development is, by design, not something that should trigger panic, and treating every low percentage Gulf system as an imminent hurricane would only make people tune out the warnings that actually matter later in the season. But a 20% formation chance sitting alongside a near certain forecast for 3 to 5 inches of flooding rain is exactly the combination that deserves real, practical attention regardless of what the system is ultimately named, or whether it is ever named at all. Rain does not check the National Hurricane Center's development percentage before it floods a road. So what does all of this actually mean for you, wherever the next system happens to be heading? If the heat has genuinely broken where you live this week, that relief is real, and it is worth appreciating after what has been, by any honest measure, one of the most extreme heat stretches on record across both sides of the Atlantic this year. It does not mean the broader pattern behind that heat has gone anywhere. And the same, ingredients responsible for weeks of record temperatures are continuing to shape whatever comes next, whether that is a new heat dome rebuilding somewhere else or a tropical system organizing on schedule over the Gulf. If you are anywhere near Florida, the Gulf Coast, or the southeastern United States this weekend, the practical takeaway is straightforward. Check your local forecast for flash flood guidance regardless of whether this system ever earns a name, since a 20% formation chance says nothing about how much rain a disorganized system can still drop directly on top of you. And if you have travel booked through Tampa, Orlando, Fort Lauderdale, Miami, Jacksonville, or Tallahassee in the coming days, it is worth checking your airline's website directly for any weather-related rebooking waiver, since several major carriers issued exactly that kind of penalty-free rebooking option the last time. A similar system moved through the region back in June, and airlines typically only publish those waivers 24 to 48 hours before conditions actually arrive, meaning it is worth checking again closer to your travel date, even if nothing has been announced yet. The honest, grounded summary of this week's weather is this: a historic UK and European heat wave, the third of the year in Britain alone, is genuinely breaking down this week following a June that broke national temperature records on 3 consecutive days, and a wider European heat wave that pushed Spain past 45 degrees Celsius and triggered amber health alerts across England. At almost the same moment, a similar heat pattern across the United States is following the same arc, building, peaking, and beginning to break down after a second major wave this month, one that arrived only weeks after an earlier 4th of July heat event already tied to 44 confirmed deaths. Behind both of those cooldowns, a Gulf of Mexico system carrying a 20% chance of becoming Tropical Storm Bertha is organizing almost exactly on the historical average date for the Atlantic season's second named storm, arriving despite a strong El Nino driving near record wind shear across the Caribbean and a below normal seasonal outlook overall. Regardless of whether it ever earns that name, forecasters consider 3 to 5 inches of flooding rain across Tampa Bay, the Big Bend, and the Florida Panhandle to be near certain over the coming days. None of these events are separate weather stories arriving in the same week by coincidence. They are the same underlying atmospheric pattern releasing itself in 2 different forms, heat finally breaking in one place while the moisture behind it builds into rain somewhere else, a rhythm that has now repeated itself in one form or another every few weeks since this summer began. We are going to keep tracking both halves of this pattern as they develop, sourced the same way we did today, straight from the Met Office, the National Hurricane Center, and the meteorologists actually watching both sides of the Atlantic in real time, not recycled headlines dressed up as breaking news. Subscribe so you do not miss it if the system earns its name over the weekend, because based on how closely it is tracking the historical calendar so far, that update likely will not take long. And leave that comment below. Tell me whether the heat has actually broken where you live yet, or whether you are still waiting on the storms that are supposed to bring it down. Because behind every one of these forecasts is a family in Suffolk finally opening their windows again after weeks of record heat, a traveler in Tampa checking their airline app for a rebooking waiver that has not been issued yet, and a forecaster somewhere watching 2 entirely different kinds of danger, one ending and one just beginning, unfold on the same radar screen in the very same week. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.